Mark Johnson and George Lakoff's book, Metaphors We Live By, is one of my favorites. These authors point out that simple, unexamined metaphors lie behind the very structure of our thought. The idea of argument as war is an example. We talk about winning an argument or having an indispensable position or an indefensible position, about being right on target or shooting down objectives, etc. We could imagine living in another culture where argument is regarded as a kind of dance and where there are no winners or losers. Today, Jesus addresses two metaphors or primal understandings of religion that deeply influence the people of his society and of our own. The first is the idea of a spiritual quest, a search for God. The second is that of church as a community of saints set apart from the world. Jesus upsets the assumptions that lie so deep in our consciousness that we simply assume that this is just what faith is. So my sermon has two parts, and the first part is on the spiritual quest. On December 24th, 1915, Albert Einstein was drinking tea in his Berlin apartment when he received a crumpled, muddy, blood-stained letter, and it was from the trenches of World War I. It contained a message from the great genius and astronomer Karl Schwarzschild, and I want to quote the letter's final words. Quote, "As you see, the war treated me kindly enough in spite of heavy gunfire to allow me to get away from it all and to take this walk in the land of your ideas." Now, the letter astounded Einstein, not simply because one of the most respected scientists in Germany was commanding an artillery on the Russian front, or because of Schwarzschild's deep fear of a coming catastrophe of global proportions. But in tiny print on the back page, only legible through the use of a magnifying glass, Schwarzschild had sent him the first exact solution to the Einstein field equation of general relativity. Now, Schwarzschild's approach worked really well on a normal star, which you might imagine as being like a kind of, if you put a bowling ball onto your bed, you can imagine it would depress all the area around it. The problem arises when a star is large enough and exhausts its fuel and begins to collapse. That star would keep compressing until the force of gravity grew so great that space would become infinitely curved and closed in on itself. The result would be an inescapable abyss, permanently cut off from the rest of the universe. Now, out of a sense of duty and perhaps a desire to show that a faithful Jew could be a good German, Schwarzschild volunteered to be in the army and to serve in the war. And during a mustard gas attack, he was helping two of his soldiers who were panicking, and he was slow in putting on his own mask. And his exposure to mustard gas may have been what initiated an autoimmune disorder in him that led to his death, very painful death through sores over his whole body, not very many months later. Now, Schwarzschild at first dismissed his discovery that he made. He thought that maybe the mathematics couldn't be applied to real life, that it was just a kind of anomaly. But over time, this idea of something totally cut off began to frighten and worry him. In his last letter from Russia to his wife, he wrote that this idea, quote, "has an irrepressible force and darkens all my thoughts. It is a void without form or dimension, a shadow I cannot see, but one that I can feel with the entirety of my soul." Now, there was a young man named Richard Courant who spent the night talking with Schwarzschild on his last night alive. And Schwarzschild told him that this concentration of mass would distort space and causality, that the true horror was that since light would never escape from it, this singularity would be unknowable, utterly unchangeable, entirely isolated from everything else. Schwarzschild was the first person ever to contemplate the meaning of a black hole. But all of us are capable of imagining a place that is completely cut off from God. In fact, most of us have been there. There is nothing more terrifying than true isolation. Perhaps you feel misunderstood or set apart by a secret or by an experience that you've had that no one else could understand. Maybe you believe that something that you did in the past simply could never be forgiven, or that you've been harmed and cannot be healed. Perhaps just the busyness of your life or the loneliness of it makes a real connection with another person seem impossible. Or maybe you just feel like you're missing something that everyone else is experiencing. You feel cut off from God. Now, the religious leaders of Jesus' time, they see him sharing meals with deplorable, notoriously immoral people, with prostitutes and the tax collectors who collaborate with the Roman Empire. They often point out that these people haven't really changed. They haven't really repented. They wonder if Jesus is just incurably naive. They argue that anyone who is from God would have the wisdom to realize just how bad these people were. And in response, Jesus tells 3 stories, 2 really short ones and 1 much, much longer one. The first is about a wealthy shepherd who leaves 99 sheep behind to find the one that was lost. And when he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders and rejoices. Another is about a woman sweeping out her house looking for a lost coin, and it concludes saying, "There is joy in the presence of the angels over one sinner who repents." And the last story is the much longer story of the prodigal son. So in other words, Jesus takes our dominant metaphor of a spiritual quest and he turns it on its head. Religion is not seeking God. It is about God's persistence in finding us. It is about overcoming separation. It is about that incredible joy of reunion. As a young management consultant, one of my best and closest friends in our Santa Monica office was a young engineer who graduated from Stanford. His name was Walid Iskandar. Walid had grown up in Lebanon in the 1970s, and he was a deeply sincere and thoughtful and delightful and fun person. When I think of him, I still see him with a kind of like a mischievous smile on his face, a little twinkle in his eye. I can still see him as if it was just yesterday. In college, I played rugby with a young freshman who was still trying to figure out the game. He was also trying to figure out a lot of big things in his own life. His name was Mark Bingham. What these 2 friends of mine share in common is that they both lost their lives 21 years ago today in the terrorist attacks that we experienced at the beginning of the century. Now, in my imagination, you can imagine they are perpetually young. And in their last moments, I think about those last moments, and I imagine that despite the confusion and the fear, I believe that God was with them. In 2018, there were 12 boys who were on a soccer team with their coach, and they were seeking shelter in a cave. I don't know if you remember their story, but as the waters rose, as the monsoon's waters rose, they kept going further back into the depths of the labyrinthine caves that were being flooded. And as the monsoon season continued to progress, there were very few people who thought they would ever survive. I remember watching the documentary about those British divers who were experts in cave diving and talking about not being able to even see their hands in front of their face masks as they dove, about wriggling into impossibly tiny places and then having to do that over and over again as they worked their way deeper into the labyrinth of caves to find the boys. I don't know if you remember this, but that look of amazement when the boys saw the diver surfacing out of the water. This is the joy of being discovered. This is the joy that lies at the heart of faith. The second idea that Jesus overturns is the idea that the church, and I love this. I'm going to get my bulletin out. All of you have a look at this. You know how in the psalm we'll choose one verse and we'll all sing that verse? God is in the company of the righteous. That's like the perfect little summary of that other metaphor, that other story within us that's deep a part of how we understand what religion is. The idea is that the church exists as a kind of holy people set apart from the world. And you see this so often in the conviction that you must first think or say or do something before you can be acceptable to God. Yesterday, I was having lunch with one of my oldest friends. Her name is Megan, and she was talking about the funeral of her father that recently took place. And so the whole funeral came and went. They had, at the very end of the service, the pastor got up and stood in the front of the congregation, the people who were there, and he said something like this. He said, Pat was a great husband and a father and a lawyer and a community leader. But until Pat found Jesus and accepted him into his heart, Pat was a sinner. Only through the sacrifice of Jesus are we cleansed from sin. No matter how hard we might try to be good, until you have accepted Jesus, you are a sinner. And so that's what he said to Megan and her family and everyone who is gathered there. And Jesus completely refutes this idea. He turns that idea on its head. It's not that we become good and then God somehow rewards us. Instead, God helps us so that we can be capable of being good, so we can be healed. The critics of Jesus feel offended by his connection to the people who break the rules. And Jesus tells them, these are exactly the people I came to help. God's love is abundant and overflowing. God will always persist in finding the lost. Now, the point is that God's love and mercy always come before anything else. We do not first accept Jesus in our heart and then become free from sin. The church is not a community of former sinners. We are a community of actively sinning sinners. And God does not reward us for living well or believing something or saying something. God makes living well and faith possible. God brings us back to life. Now today we celebrate Congregation Sunday. It's one of my favorite days of the year. I missed the men and boys choir. I mean, I ached for having you guys back. I'm so grateful for your service at the cathedral, and to hear your voices is just brings me back to who I really am. There is no other community in the world that is quite like this one. But let me be perfectly clear. We have not stopped screwing up. And yet, somehow, we are loved by God. Although we continue to slip up, we keep encountering God's grace. And this makes us a joyful community of people who, against all odds, God has found a way to discover and to find. I want to close by a poem by Denise Levertov, because a friend of mine challenged me to see if I would have a poem that would express the sense of the peace that passes all understanding. This poem is called The Avowal. As swimmers dare to lie face to the sky and water bears them, as hawks rest upon air and air sustains them, so would I learn to attain free fall and float into Creator Spirit's deep embrace, knowing no effort earns that all-surrounding grace. In the face of the black holes of our life, in the face of everyday cruelty, isolation, and sudden death, what metaphors are we going to live by? Will we see our life as a spiritual quest or as the experience of being found by God? Are we the holy, righteous ones, or simply lost souls, grateful every day that God is searching for us? My friends, rejoice with me